before the first altar, before the first temple was raised from stone, before even the first name was spoken to the wind. There was a moment, a pause, a stillness so complete that the universe itself seemed to lean in. It wasn't a prayer, it wasn't a question, it wasn't even a thought. It was permission. Something inside the earliest human beings, a spark not born from instinct, but from awareness opened. It wasn't light, it wasn't sound, but it was received. And from somewhere beyond form, they answered. We call them gods, but they were not always worshipped, not at first. They were seen, and more importantly, they were recognized. Not with eyes, but with soul. The first agreement did not begin with fire. It began with mutual recognition. You see, the gods did not descend uninvited. They came because something called them, not with words, not with ritual, but with attention. And attention is the oldest form of invocation. The early humans didn't know what they were doing. They didn't understand the implications, but in looking to the stars, in dreaming of voices that lived in the river, in feeling awe before thunder and flame, they opened a door. They made a gesture that could not be taken back. Not submission, not surrender, something far more ancient, invitation. If you are there, I am listening. That was the beginning, the first alignment, the first thread woven between mortal mind and something other. It wasn't dramatic. There were no pillars of fire, no flaming swords in the sky. Only a shift, a turning inward, a slow recognition that consciousness was not alone. And when that thread was formed, when the first human looked up with wonder and felt wonder looking back, the agreement began. Not in language, but in vibration, not written, but etched into the shared field of being between what is below and what watches from above. Before myth, before law, before memory, there was consent, there was contact, there was the beginning. They did not fall from the sky. They did not arrive in ships of metal or flame. They descended through perception. The ones who watched had always been near, hovering in the periphery of awareness, present in the pulse behind thunder, in the rhythm of wind over stone, in the silence between breaths. They were not distant. They were waiting. Waiting for that moment when humanity became just conscious enough to look up, not with fear, but with recognition. And when that moment came, they moved. Not through space, but through invitation. They did not invade. They responded. Because attention is a gate, and collective attention, focused, honest, unguarded, is a summons. And so the descent began. Some say it was in dream. Some say it was through light. Some say they came on the breath of the first fire, lit not for survival, but for meaning. They appeared in many forms. To some, as shining ones, tall, radiant, eyes like mirrored skies. To others, as serpents of knowledge curled around sacred trees, whispering truths too vast for language. To others still, they were simply the voice inside the cave, in the dark, that answered back. They did not all come at once. Some watched from above. Some entered slowly, through symbol, through sensation, through the patterns that arise when spirit touches matter. They were not all the same. Some were gentle. Some were harsh. Some offered light. Others offered the consequences of its misuse. But they all came through the same door. Human will. Not just one person's, but a collective yearning, a planetary hum of unfinished awareness calling out to something greater. And that yearning, was heard. This is what we've forgotten, that gods do not rule by default, they are received. That divinity, like light, must first be seen before it can touch. They did not come to conquer, they came to participate. Because the first agreement was not submission, it was co-creation, an alignment, a shared experiment between mortal and mythic, between what crawled and what had already risen. And so they descended, not into matter, but into meaning. And the world began to change. Because once the Watchers entered the field, reality itself began to bend toward the sacred geometry of their presence. The Watchers came bearing gifts, not gifts in the way we understand, but gifts of structure, not objects or gold, but frameworks for understanding existence itself. They gave us calendars, not mere tools for measuring time, but keys to the cosmic rhythm, to the cycles of the moon, the sun, and the stars, opening the doors of sacred timing. They gave us symbols, geometry, and signs that encoded truths beyond words, languages of light and shape that spoke directly to the soul. They gave us an agreement, a pact unspoken, woven into the very fabric of reality, that we would uphold a balance between worlds, between the seen and unseen. These were not easy gifts. They demanded responsibility, a vigilance of attention. The Watchers did not hand down magic without price. They asked us implicitly to become caretakers of reality itself, to keep the doors open, to tend the flames of connection between heaven and earth. What they offered was not a shortcut, but a path of framework for becoming. It was a way to hold the infinite within the finite, to map the vastness onto the delicate architecture of human perception. And with these gifts came expectation. They sought not worship, but engagement. Not blind obedience, but conscious participation. Because the pact was mutual, a dance of will and grace, an invitation to co-create. They gave us the blueprint and asked us to build the temple not of stone, but of mind and heart. And so, the first temples were not built with hammers, but with attention. The sacred architecture of consciousness became the first true home for the divine within the human experience. The agreement was never one-sided. It was not a gift given and taken lightly. What humanity offered in return was not gold or tribute. It was something far more profound and far more dangerous. We gave them our perception. Not just what we saw with eyes, but the very framework through which reality was experienced. We opened a space inside ourselves, a place in our minds and hearts where the gods could dwell. It was a sacred void created by human attention and will, a receptacle for the divine presence to take form within our world. This was the true price. The right to shape what we perceive, to filter the infinite through human senses, to decide what is real and what is not. In doing so, we surrendered a part of our sovereignty, the power to interpret, to assign meaning, to declare what is sacred was now shared with beings beyond our own. And this sharing was not without consequence. With this opening came responsibility, because to give space to something beyond the human was to also inherit its will. The gods did not merely observe, they influenced, they guided, sometimes they demanded. And within this exchange, fear took root. Fear of losing control, fear of being overwhelmed by forces beyond comprehension, but also awe, deep reverence for the unseen, a recognition that something greater had chosen to enter our lives. This duality between empowerment and submission, between sovereignty and surrender, became the foundation of human spirituality. It shaped our rituals, our myths, our longing. Because once the gods were invited inside, there was no turning back. The sacred contract became etched into the very fabric of collective consciousness. And even when forgotten, even when misunderstood, it pulsed beneath the surface, a hidden current that still guides how we relate to the divine, to power, and to ourselves. We gave them a seat within our minds, a key to our reality. And that key has never been fully reclaimed. Long before stones were shaped or mortar mixed, the first temple was not a place, it was a state of consciousness. It existed in the silent space between thought and perception, in the stillness where attention gathers like a gathering light. The early humans, before they carved monuments, built their sacred spaces within the architecture of their minds. These were temples made of focus, of intention, of collective remembering. They were invisible, yet powerful beyond measure. When a group gathered around a fire, when eyes met in shared awe, when breath synchronized in chant, a temple was formed. Not of stone, but of presence. This temple was alive. It held the agreement between humanity and the gods, the thread connecting flesh to spirit, mortal to eternal. In this mental sanctuary, the divine found a home. It was a place where the boundary between worlds blurred, where the seen and unseen danced. Every ritual, every prayer was an act of construction, laying bricks of thought and mortar of feeling to hold a sacred space in the midst of the ordinary. This temple was fragile. It required care. It needed constant tending through attention and reverence. If the focus faltered, the temple crumbled, the connection weakened, the gods withdrew. And yet, it was the most enduring temple ever built. Because it was not limited by stone or land, it was woven into the very fabric of human experience. The greatest temples of history, the pyramids, the ziggurats, the stone circles, were but shadows of this original sanctuary. They were echoes of the mental space that first welcomed the gods. And this mental temple persists. Within dreams, within myth, within the pulse of ritual that still echoes in our collective blood. Even now, when we light a candle, when we gather in silence, when we speak names too old to remember, we build it anew. A temple that transcends space and time, existing wherever attention gathers, where intention calls, where the divine is invited not into stone, but into the heart. This is the true sacred architecture, invisible yet indestructible, the first and last temple built by humanity, the place where the gods truly dwell. The agreement was not merely spoken, it was woven into the very fabric of consciousness, into the flow of time itself. This binding was neither contract nor promise, but a sacred knot tied with threads of intention and attention, sealed with the breath of the cosmos. Once formed, it became impossible to undo, not because of chains or force, but because it lived within the deepest currents of being. It was a living contract embedded in DNA, in dreams, in the unspoken rhythms of the heart. No human could simply walk away. To reject it would be to reject the part of themselves that remembered the divine thread. And no god could abandon their end, for they too were caught in the echo of that first call. This bond shaped reality. It bent history, twisting empires and civilizations around the axis of that primal pact. It defined who we were and are, not just as individuals, but as a species. Some have called it a curse, others a blessing. But it was always both, because with the gift of connection came the burden of responsibility. The gods asked for guardianship, for stewardship, not blind obedience. They asked humanity to carry a flame that could either illuminate or consume. To uphold the agreement was to walk a razor's edge, balancing freedom with devotion, creation with restraint. And those who forgot the binding or sought to break it found themselves lost in chaos, disconnected from the source and from themselves. The binding was not a leash, it was a bridge, a way to carry the divine within the human without losing the human within the divine. It was the first sacred dance between what is eternal and what is transient, and it still beats in our veins, quiet yet unyielding, waiting to be remembered and embraced once more. Time passed. The first agreement, once clear and vivid, began to blur like an ancient painting left to weather. With each generation, the sacred thread frayed, its meaning diluted into myth, its power diluted into ritual. The living contract transformed into a distant story, a shadow of itself. Humanity grew busy, lost in the noise of survival and desire, turning outward to stone and gold, away from the inner temple. Gods became idols carved from rock, distant and silent. The pact was no longer felt, only remembered as obligation or fear. This forgetting was not an accident, it was woven into the fabric of our becoming. Because forgetting is part of the journey, a necessary descent into separation, to learn through loss what cannot be taught by presence. In this age, the agreement did not vanish, it became instinct. The search for authority, the need for external power, the longing for connection found expression in religions, empires, and kings, each claiming to carry the torch of the original pact, each trying to touch the divine from a place increasingly distant. And yet, beneath the surface, something pulsed, a faint, persistent memory that the gods were still listening, still waiting, still present in the dance. The age of forgetting was a test, a darkness before dawn, a necessary veil to temper the flame of the sacred agreement until humanity was ready to remember its true nature once more. The original agreement, the first sacred pact between humanity and the gods, did not disappear into oblivion. Instead, it took on new forms, woven intricately into the fabric of human culture, ritual, and even our very biology. Though forgotten consciously by many, its imprint remains deeply embedded, echoing through time and memory like a persistent, haunting melody. Rituals, for instance, are far more than mere ceremonies or performances. They are the living, breathing threads that tie us to that ancient contract, often unbeknownst to those who perform them. Each repeated gesture, chant, or offering is a silent reaffirmation of the original bond, a moment when human attention is still gathered to open a doorway, invite presence, or honor forces beyond the visible world. Consider the geometry of ancient temples, their precise alignments to the sun, moon, and stars. These architectural marvels are not simply monuments to faith or power, but codified expressions of the sacred structure given by the gods themselves. Their forms reflect the rhythms and patterns of the cosmos, embedding the pact into stone. They are physical manifestations of a contract made in the invisible realms, places where heaven and earth converge, where the divine can be encountered within the mortal realm. This architecture of spirit extends beyond grand stonework into the patterns we trace in our bodies, our languages, and our art. Symbols, whether drawn on parchment, carved in wood, or painted on skin, serve as keys or sigils encoded agreements and reminders of the first pact. The circle, the spiral, the cross, the serpentine carry echoes of the original contract's meaning. vibrations from a time when symbols were the very language of the divine-human interaction. Moreover, this pact does not only live in culture, but courses through our very blood. The lineage of humanity carries within it the echoes of that first agreement. Genetic memory, epigenetics, and the transmission of ancestral trauma and wisdom ensure that the connection with the divine pact is not merely conceptual, but embodied. Certain inherited traits on affinity for music, a sensitivity to sacred sites, a longing for transcendence are like whispers from the past, invitations woven into our biology to remember and renew. The blood itself, the carrier of life and identity, is also the vessel for this ancient agreement's resonance. Throughout history, blood has been ritualistically offered and honored not as a mere sacrifice, but as a sacred medium that bridges the human and divine. This profound symbolism reveals an understanding that life itself is the currency of connection, and the pact requires ongoing renewal in the living flow of existence. Yet, the echoes in ritual, symbol, and blood are often faint whispered beneath layers of forgetting, distortion, and appropriation. Many participate unknowingly, following customs or traditions that once held potent meaning, but now function as hollow shells. Still, the resonance persists, a subtle hum beneath the surface, waiting for the attentive heart to awaken. To truly grasp the fullness of this first agreement, one must listen beyond the surface of history and tradition. One must attend to the invisible threads weaving through our ceremonies, languages, and bodies, the subtle contracts made anew each time we turn our gaze inward and outward with intention. In these echoes lie both our greatest heritage and our deepest challenge: to move beyond rote repetition and reconnect with the living, breathing Pactan invitation, not to blind servitude, but to conscious, reciprocal relationship with the divine forces that first stepped toward humanity and asked, "Will you walk with us?" This invitation remains open, every ritual enacted with awareness, every symbol drawn with intention, every breath breathed with presence is an activation of the ancient contract. The gods still watch, still wait for the living to remember that the first agreement was never broken, only obscured. And the power to renew it lies in each of us, in our ability to reclaim ritual as sacred communion, to see symbols as languages of the soul, to honor the bloodline as the living vessel of divine human unity. This is the call to awaken, to step fully into the legacy of that first agreement, to become co-creators once again in a covenant written not just in stars or stone, but in the very essence of life itself. Pause, breathe, listen. The ancient pact, the first sacred agreement, was never just a moment in time. It is not a story that ended. It is not a myth relegated to the dust of history. It is alive, not in the skies above, nor only in the pages of forgotten scrolls, but in the breath of every human who stops and chooses where to place their attention. Because attention is a door, a gateway, a vibration. When you look outward and give your gaze to the noise, to the distractions, to the fleeting and the false, you close the pact. But when you turn inward, when you listen to the silence between your thoughts, when you open your heart to the whispers beneath the world, you activate it. It lives in the spaces you hold sacred, in the rituals you perform with presence, not just repetition, in the symbols you honor as living language, not dead signs, in the moments you remember you are both human and more, a bridge between worlds. The gods never left. They simply await your remembering. They are patient. They are silent. They are watching not to control, but to witness the unfolding of a covenant that binds us all. This agreement, this sacred thread ties you to the eternal dance between the seen and unseen, the finite and infinite. It asks nothing less than your presence, your willingness to hold both mystery and form, to honor the divine not as distant rulers, but as partners in creation. Pause again. Feel it. The pact is here, within you. It has never broken. It has never faded. And every time you choose awareness, every time you choose connection, you renew it. You become the living temple where gods and humans meet. And the story, the true story, continues.